All right, welcome to week number 14 in plant biology here at NICC. We are going to be reading out of chapter 26 in the Biology 2E textbook this week, and we're going to be looking at the evolution of seed plants. So when we're talking about seed plants, we're understanding that this group of plants is going to be different than the seedless plants that we talked about last week, like the ferns, and then the bryophytes as well are not seed plants, but we see along this evolutionary trajectory from the bryophytes, we're seeing this development of this ever-increasing complexity within these organisms. When we see the seedless vascular plants, we're starting to see the development of vascular tissue, still no seeds. When we're moving into the seed plants, we have both seeds and vascular tissue in all of these plants. So it's important to understand that as we're going through these sections, we're sort of following this evolutionary arc of plants on this planet. So this week we're going to be reading out of chapter 26, sections 26.1 and 26.2 in the textbook. So we're going to be looking at the evolution of seed plants as well as gymnosperms, or these sort of early seed plants. And then next week we'll come back with 26.3 and 26.4, and then also maybe get into some chapter 32 next week as well. We'll see how it goes for time. But so this week we're going to be looking at 26.1, which is the evolution of seed plants, and 26.2, which are the gymnosperms. All right, so in the evolutionary story of plants, it's important to understand that, again, the bryophytes really represent this early movement from aquatic habitats onto land habitats by plants. This was a new sort of phenomenon in the life of for life on this planet, and the development of bryophytes really sort of opens up these terrestrial habitats to newly evolving life forms that we see again with the vascular seedless plants. But again, we still aren't getting seeds, so even these seedless plants that we were talking about last week are still tied to either aquatic habitats or very, very moist habitats for reproduction. Ferns need moist habitats to reproduce. Mosses, liverworts, hornworts, all of them need moisture, high levels of moisture, for those gametes to move and fertilize one another. So they are really limited by the availability of water, and what we see with the evolution of the evolution of seed plants is their ability to colonize these new terrestrial habitats because they will not be tied to water for fertilization events during sexual reproduction. This is a critically important evolutionary leap that these early seed plants make and allow them to exploit new dry habitats that are otherwise unavailable if fertilization events require moisture. With these early seed plants, we see this dominance of the sporophyte generation as well. Again, remember, with bryophytes, we see the dominance of the gametophyte generation. These plants, when you think of gymnosperms or really any of the seed plants, which you think about when you think of an oak tree or a pine tree or a grass or whatever, these are all the sporophyte generations, and we see this sort of locking into this lifestyle choice, this sporophyte dominant choice, or at least option, with all of the seed plants moving forward in an evolutionary sense. It's a conserved trait throughout. So we see the development of both seeds and pollen as distinguishing features for the seed plants. With these two structures, we still have this alternation of generations that we saw before and we described, except that in this case, the pollen grains are the male gametophytes, and they then contain the sperm or the gametes of the plant. And we also see the female gametophyte as well. After we have the development of the gymnosperm group, we also start to see the development of the angiosperm group. And the angiosperms are much more modern, and we see them starting to develop about 125 million years ago. So they are much more recent than the gymnosperm group. Within the angiosperms, we see the development of flowers and fruits as an evolutionary adaptation, which really allows for more complex sort of reproductive strategies and seed dispersal strategies and the protection of seeds as well, which again further allows these angiosperms to exploit new habitats that even the gymnosperms can't quite access based on restrictions for say, seed health and things like that. All right, so let's start talking specifically about gymnosperms. And the word gymnosperm means naked seed because unlike angiosperms, which are completely enclosed, these gymnosperms are not completely enclosed. They're only partially protected from the outside environment. The protection of these developing of the ovary rather is done by these modified leaves called the sporophylls, which again are part of this sporophyte generation and form what's known as the integument around these reproductive structures in it. But it's not nearly as complete around the seed, again harkening back to the name gymnosperm, as we see with the angiosperm. We do see possibilities of either monoecious or dioecious lifestyles within the gymnosperm group. With monoecious plants, they're producing both male and female cones or reproductive structures. Within dioecious, we have both male and female plants, but they're separate. Either of these are used within this group. The life cycle of a conifer is a good sort of descriptive example for the gymnosperms in general, and we can start out really looking at sort of what's called the microsporocyte, which is eventually gives rise to the male gametophytes or pollen grains. And if you've ever parked a car underneath a pine tree while it's dropping pollen, you'll be acutely aware of what this sort of thing is. It will cover a car with like a sappy, sort of sticky yellow dust, which is incredibly infuriating to try to get off of the surface of a car. So we're starting out with these plants releasing this pollen into the environment, and they are entirely wind pollinated for the most part. The cycads can be beetle pollinated. Most of the conifers are wind pollinated. So these microsporocytes come in contact with the female reproductive structures, the ovulate cones, where they come into contact with the megasporocytes, and they then fertilize and then develop into a zygote or a 2N seed, which then is released and grows into a new sporophyte generation, which we then see as a tree. The figure 26.8 in the textbook has a really nice description of this, along with some pretty good visuals. So we can see that the sperm, the 1N sperm, really comes into contact with the megaspore in within the female reproductive structures. There's fertilization, development again into this 2N seed, which then grows into the 2N sporophyte, which again develops these cones, the female cones and the male cones, or one of each, or whatever their strategy is, and reproduction continues. As far as the diversity of gymnosperm goes, there are 4 different phyla within this group: the conifers, the cycads, the ginkgos, and then the ctenophores. We see, the ctenophytes, and what we see with this major group are the conifers, and these are sort of what you will think about when you think about sort of the generic kind of gymnosperm. These are pine trees. Everybody's probably familiar with, at some level, with any sort of pine tree, and these are all in the conifer group. And there's a huge variety of species. They've adapted to almost every single kind of terrestrial habitat, from deserts to semi-aquatic swamps. I mean, the diversity within the conifer group is pretty intense. But they do all share some fairly common structural adaptations that we see. They all have scale or needle-like leaves. This really reduces water evaporation from the plants. They have a thick cuticle on top, so a thick waxy layer. They're well adapted to snow, so that's why we see these conifer forests in the far north are up high in elevation, where we have these heavy snow loads that would take out these deciduous angiosperm trees pretty consistently. You know, this sort of traditional Christmas tree shape sheds snow really well, so they can survive in these cold, dry climates reasonably well. They can at least exist up there. There are a few deciduous conifers, the tamarack and the larch. They're really quite beautiful, especially this time of year. They get really bright yellow needles. There are a few of them, but they're not nearly as sort of well known as the regular kind of pine tree that stays green year round and loses needles sort of progressively rather than all at once. The cycads are a much less known group in the gymnosperms. Superficially, they resemble palm trees. They have a very sort of palm tree kind of look to them. They do definitely have cones, and we see that a lot of times we have beetle pollination for the cycads. It's important to understand that in the age of the dinosaur, the cycads were really a dominant part of the flora in the time. They've been reduced. Evolutionary pressures have just made their numbers dwindle, and so there's only a few remaining species left. That's not to say they're not important. They're just a more minor component of the flora on Earth. Ginkgo biloba is the only remaining species in the ginkgophyte group. They are unique to China, but they are widely distributed now as ornamental trees. Usually only the males are planted because the females produce a very, very stinky seed that when you step on them really, really stinks. So usually the males are planted as trees. They're very sort of tough and able to withstand lots of pollution and things like that. But there's only this one species left, the Ginkgo biloba, in the ginkgophyte group. The gnetophytes are the sort of last remaining group that we're going to talk about in the gymnosperms. Again, not a lot of sort of charisma in this group. I'd say the one plant that is sort of most important in this group is ephedra, and this plant produces the compound ephedrine, which is a really good nasal decongestion, and also a chemical cousin, at least, to amphetamine. So this plant has, some medicinal properties in sort of traditional medicine and in modern medicine as well. But again, the gnetophytes are a small group within the gymnosperms. All right, this wraps up this week's conversation about the evolution of seed plants, and then we moved specifically into the gymnosperms this week as well. Next week we will move into the angiosperms. So next week will be 26.3 and also 26.4, the role of seed plants. And so we'll wrap up the seed plants within these 2 weeks. So again, reading for this chapter is again 26.1 and 26.2 in the Biology 2E textbook, and I will talk to you next week. Thank you.